listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff, how are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
I'm good, but you know what? New levels of human stupidity are being reached. With all that's going on in the news, and this is not a news show, but the story I'm going to report on is that the baby from Nirvana's Nevermind album cover is suing the band at Kurt Cobain's estate for alleged sexual exploitation. So for people familiar with this cover or with this album, it probably doesn't need to be explained. But for those who don't know, Nirvana's Nevermind album was recorded like 30 years ago, and it's a baby in a pool being lured in by a dollar bill that's on a fish hook, and the baby is naked. Sexual exploitation never crossed my mind with this cover, but apparently this has left the baby, who's now a 30-year-old grown person, so distraught that he's suing the band members and people associated with the band for, I think there were like 10 people for like $150,000 a piece, so like $1.5 million. Absolutely crazy. What do you think?
Um, I don't know. I think this sounds a little bit like a money grab, almost like the picture itself. But that's just me. I don't guess I don't have an opinion on it at all, one way or the other. It just seems kind of a weird time to do it, but who knows?
I know it's definitely a money grab. It's being opportunistic, and this is, I mean, this is why everybody's afraid to do anything in this society, is that you could be sued for absolutely nothing. I'm sorry, there's no way anybody would be able to look at this picture and know it was this person, this 30-year-old man, now, if he wasn't out saying that was me and I was exploited. I'm sorry. This is just craziness to me.
Well, I think the guy's been promoting it for a long time, and I'm not sure why now all of a sudden it's an issue, but I'm not a judge, and I guess not my pig, not my farm. That's the way I'll throw it out there.
Well, I'm interested to hear what our guest is going to say about it.
Yeah, so why don't we get into it a little bit? Today we have a pretty cool conversation. We're going to talk about hacking multi-factor authentication. I think most people, when they have conversation around MFA, they see it as kind of the end-all be-all, and it's certainly better than a password, but does not mean that it's perfect. So why don't we introduce our guest? His name is Roger Grimes. He's a data-driven defense evangelist at KnowBe4. He's also the author of multiple books, including one called Hacking Multi-Factor Authentication, which you can find on Amazon.com. And we'll have a link to that in our show notes. Welcome to the show, Roger.
Hey, glad to be here, Jeff and Jim, and thanks. And I just want to go on record as saying is I'm not going to blame Courtney Love. There's like this unnatural thing that wants me to blame Courtney Love, but I'm going to say it's not her fault. That's how I'll respond to that. Great album, great music, though.
Well, Roger, she is named in the lawsuit. So she is one of the people, according to the article I read, she's one of the people named in the lawsuit as being sued for $150,000 for her role in this sexual exploitation.
Yeah, it's an interesting story.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't get it, but okay, well, whatever. Why don't we stick to identity? Because I think that's what we all, I think, have more of a passion and a knowledge base on. But before we get to that, Roger, maybe you can kind of help us understand your background and how you actually got into the identity and the InfoSpec space. Is that something that you can kind of take us through as a little of a journey here, as your origin story?
Yeah. I think 34 years of computer security experience is really why I got in the field early on when I was a little kid, like I was 17, 18, 19. But I did, like everybody else, PC, network technician, all kinds of stuff on my journey. But really what kind of got me in the identity space, really it was kind of my, at least my door into it was I was a big PKI guy. And so I was doing a lot of PKI, love PKI, I love encryption and cryptography and the beauty of it. And that led to installing smart cards. And then that led to installing a lot of different MFA solutions over the years. I probably installed 200 MFA solutions in different places. I mean, probably more than anybody else I know. And I've probably truly hacked, like paid to hack, at least a couple hundred others on probably 20 different projects from different companies I owned when I worked for Microsoft and other companies, Foundstone and stuff like that. So kind of through, but it was all really through PKI that kind of got me into smart cards, which was kind of the original, one of the original multi-factor authentication solutions, and then into everything else.
And now you're a data-driven defense evangelist, which is a very cool title, and I'm not sure how you swung that at KnowBe4. So what do you actually do these days?
Yeah, actually, I have the best, easiest job in the world. I get paid to write and talk. And actually, that title, what was funny is that I got hired, and I just had written a book called Data Driven Computer Defense, and Stu was an early big fan of it, and it really is it truly is like my magnum opus, which really it literally says, hey, you should concentrate on the stuff of how you really get hacked. And it's really about data. Like we're supposedly somewhat of a mature industry, is what you would think after 30, 40 years of computers and computer security and network. But what I found out is that we're not really, that mature in our thinking. We're doing a lot of, like, most cybersecurity is best guesses and gut feelings. And when you look at the data, a lot of times the data contradicts what conventional wisdom is. Like the NIST digital identity guideline documents back in 2017, that's NIST special publication 800-63. It says that if you use long, complex passwords that have forced periodic changes, you're more likely to be compromised because of those passwords than if you had no password length requirement and you never forced a change unless you knew you were compromised. And what's funny is, so the government has the data. NIST published it, said, hey, all the previous password policy advice, oops, our bad, we're wrong. Which you should not require long, complex passwords. You shouldn't change them, have periodic changes. The US government says, we've looked at 20 years of data. It was wrong what we said. Turns out this is what you should do. And now it's been 3 or 4 years since that new digital identity guidelines, and there's not a single regulation out there, HIPAA, Sarbanes-Oxley, PCI, DSS, that it doesn't say you have to use a long, complex, frequently changing password. It's like in this industry, even when we're given the data, we don't follow it. But the whole way I got my title was, Stu said, well, what do you want your title to be? And if I was smarter, I would have said like Senior Vice President of Hacking Prevention. But I was like, how about Data Driven Evangelist? And he's like, cool. And it just kind of stuck. I hate it. I want to change it, except for it brings up cool conversations like this, where you ask me, what the heck is that title?
Well, it's definitely going to get you noticed, that's for sure. I mean, obviously, beyond just, the prolific writing career that you've had and, some of the talks that you've given. And I know that, even when we talk about like the NIST standard that you're referring to, and I think it's a good thing, though, that at least people are using the data to drive decisions and changing things. Like, oh, yeah, what we used to think was correct is no longer correct. And I feel like it's always okay to get smarter. I think the disconnect here, though, what you talked about is, people have realized that, now things are the way they are, but they don't necessarily change their own organizations or their own behaviors when it comes to things like password policies. They still see, organizations like, yep, we have our passwords rotate every 90 days, even though NIST has said, yeah, that's really not effective. Microsoft has come out as saying it's not really effective. It's just behaviors are hard to change sometimes, especially when you have, decades of thinking one way and then shifting to another. Is that something that you see as more of a behavior change, or I guess what's the root behind, organizations not really kind of jumping onto kind of that type of less password change frequency, especially when you consider that I think users would love that.
Yeah, so I think the primary problem with why computer security is so bad today, and it is bad almost everywhere. Uh, if it's not the primary problem, the problem, it's one of the top problems, is that we literally don't look at how we're attacked. Like in this case, I realized about 20 years ago, it's social engineering and unpatched software is responsible for like 90% of all hacking, and yet we'll have dozens and dozens and hundreds of other things told to us, and it's distracting. And not only do we then reteach it to each other, like, oh, you got to buy this, you got to do this, you got to do this, but even our guides, like I'm going through PCI DSS, I'm going through a lot of documents. So again, let me say this again. without a doubt, social engineering and unpatched software are the two biggest reasons. And social engineering is responsible for like 70 to 90% of all successful data breaches. Unpatched software is about 20 to 40%. Everything else added up all together across all threats is only about 1 to 10% of the risk in most organizations. With ransomware, it's a little bit different. Social engineering is about 50% of the problem. Unpatched software is about 15% of the problem. Then you have password guessing and password spray attacks and stuff like that that kind of get in there against RDP. But it's been that way for 30 years. So for 30 years, social engineering has been the number one way that people are attacked the most. You got to open up PCI DSS, the latest version. It's got 8 pages. The first control they tell you is make sure you configure your firewall securely. It's 8 pages, 20 controls, and firewalls, for the most part, do not stop today's threats. Social engineering, it's like the number eighth or ninth thing in the list. It's almost at the end, and it's like 3 sentences and 2 controls. So, why is computer security so bad? Not only are we teaching each other wrong many times, but the documents that we're told to implement, the NIST cybersecurity framework and HIPAA and Sarbanes-Oxley and all this stuff, they are literally teaching us wrong. They're like, hey, go solve these 200 controls. And they don't tell you that, hey, 2 of those controls mean almost everything. And they take those 2 controls and they put them at the end. It's almost like it's built in for us to misrank the threats.
Talk about burying the lead, huh?
Yeah, exactly. It's I always tell people it's like you live in a house and the thief is breaking through the windows again and again and again. Like every time you have stuff robbed, they're coming through a window, they break a window, they open a window, blah 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 blah. Well, what should I do? I guess I should, I've heard that they could break through doors. I heard they can come through some pretty powerful doors. So I'm going to go buy a metal door. And then there's another crime that comes through the window, and you're like, I need to add another lock to the door. That literally is how cybersecurity works today, most of the time.
That's a great analogy. You mentioned something here around ransomware, and as we pulled on the fourth wall here, we're recording this a couple weeks in advance of when folks in the world will hear it. But you've got a webinar coming up called Nuclear Ransomware. Can you give us a little bit of a summary for those who are listening now, who might be able to catch a recording of it after it went live, of kind of what you're going to be talking about and how does this play with identity?
Yeah, sure. And actually, I've been talking on that topic quite a while. And at the end of 2019, ransomware, traditional ransomware, which encrypted your data, right in November and December of 2019, took this really left turn. And they started doing what a lot of people today refer to as double extortion, but really it's quintuple extortion. Something like 85% of ransomware today now exfiltrates your data before it encrypts it. It steals as many credentials as it can steal. It steals, like if you're an employee, the average ransomware program can dwell up to 8 months before it's detected and removed. And the dwell time varies depending on who you're listening to. But let's say it dwells for days to months and sometimes years. And during that time, everybody that's typing in every password, if you're going to your Facebook account, your Twitter account, your 401k, your stock account, whatever it is, they're capturing those passwords. And then they're going to resell those passwords to other people that can compromise your accounts. They're going to try to extort customers, try to extort employees. So it really is this. What that nuclear ransomware is a big wake up call. Going, hey, it's not just data exfiltration. It certainly isn't just encryption. And every time I see a ransomware protection guy, they're like, make sure you have a good backup. I'm like, 85% of all ransomware today, 85% is exfiltrating data. And the biggest reason why people are paying today is not the encryption, because a lot of people can't trust what's encrypted, even if it got decrypted. It's the data exfiltration risk of where the hacker says, if you don't pay us, we're going to release this private crown jewel data to the internet, to other hackers. So it's wild. It's like every single guide I'm seeing on how to prevent ransomware is like, okay, you got to have a good solid backup. I'm like, the quintuple double extortion things that they do, none of that is prevented by a good backup. And let me say, a backup's not prevention. That's recovery. So I like to talk about prevention. I'm a big believer in prevention. We do not, in the cybersecurity world, talk about prevention enough.
Yeah, it seems like we have layers and layers of kind of risk mitigation, but not outright, force fields, right, to keep things out as much as we can. But even if you're doing ransomware where you've got, backups, one of the first things that ransomware does now is they've gotten smart to that, right? They've started to tailor their ransomware to go after the backup systems, to turn those off or to compromise those as well. So even if you have a backup, it may be completely useless because that's also compromised. Have you seen that as well?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, if you want to try a super simple, a super simple stupid trick, ask somebody, "Hey, do you have an offline backup?" And they go like, "Yeah." And I'm like, "Can you get to that backup online through a console?" They're like, "Yep." It's not an offline backup. If you can get to it through an online console, it is an online backup. I was like, if your offline backup doesn't require someone to physically do something to get that backup back online, it's not an offline backup. So all these people think they have these offline backups, and I'm like, what definition do y'all have? You know, it's if you can get to it, so the attacker can, or a lot of the attackers will do things like they'll change your encryption key. So, all the controls today say that any of your data storage and your backups have to be encrypted. So everybody has encryption keys for their tape backups and data backups and that sort of stuff. The ransomware guys will change the encryption keys so that all of your backups are being encrypted with a key you do not know what it is. Almost none of them report that your encryption key was changed. And then you're like, oh, I've got good, solid offline backups. I can tell they haven't changed. Well, they've been putting them with a different encryption key for weeks. So when you go to restore it, it doesn't work.
Yeah, I feel like this is a little bit of the old movie line, right? I don't think that word means what you think it means. When
Yeah.
we talk about offline and offline, or offline and online capabilities. You've written several books, and the one I think that kind of sparked the conversation here was around hacking multi-factor authentication. We're kind of going to get into that, but I'm always curious when we talk with folks who have done the show that have written things is how do you actually get into writing a book? I know you've written I don't know, dozens, I guess, at this point. How did you start in that path?
So yeah, so I just finished up my third book for Wiley on ransomware, the Ransomware Protection Playbook. But I wrote my first one like 20 years ago, and I was actually at the time I was asked to be a technical editor for McGraw Hill, and I was editing all these people's books, and I'm like, these guys are wrong. They're crazy. I can write better than this. I can write a book. So I wrote a book, and I couldn't get it published. I had 100 rejection letters. Literally, the wild thing about it is every time I got rejected, I knew that eventually I'd get published. Like I literally kept those 100 letters, put them in a book to remind me what it was like to fail 100 times. And one day, Riley decided to publish that book. Like it happened in like literally 10 minutes. I sent an email to O'Reilly, and I got Wiley on the mind. So O'Reilly, uh, I sent it like a query thing, and 10 minutes later, I had a book deal. I had my first book deal and wrote my first book. And once you write one, if you can prove to people that you can actually write a book, that's like literally at least half of what you need to do. You need to make the publisher think that you can write a book that at least 5 to 15,000 people are going to buy because they got to invest tens of thousands of dollars in you. And like everybody I meet's like, oh, I'm going to write all these stories about my great times with fighting hackers on the SOC. That book's been written 5 times and didn't sell 5,000 copies. You need to do better. you know, so you need to write a book. You need to prove to the publisher that you can write and that you can actually write the book. Like so many people get a book contract and then they write 2 or 3 chapters and they never finish because they said everything they needed to say first couple of chapters, or it was hard to concentrate that long, or it was a lot harder than they thought. So if you can prove to a book publisher that you've got a book that 5 to 15,000 people will buy, because again, they've got to recover their expenses and what they do to help you get your book out there, then they're going to be interested. But then if you prove to them, I will write this book on time, let me tell you, if you tell me you can write the book and do it on time on the schedule that you've either given them or they've given you, you'll be given so many book offers, you'll get tired of writing books.
So, what's the most important first step then if I want to start writing a book, other than perseverance and being able to handle rejection?
Yeah, that is a big part of it. I would say go to any site. Wiley.com is a great site to go to. Download their book submission form and look at what the questions they're asking you. Like a third of them are going to be, can you write an example chapter? They'll ask for an example chapter. They're going to want to know about your expertise, why you want to do this book. They want to see the chapters you're going to create, the organization, that sort of stuff. And then the other big part of it, at least a third of it, is you need to prove to them that this book will sell. As a matter of fact, you'll be going, isn't that your job? You're supposed to sell it. Well, they're going to be wasting, or not wasting, but spending tens of thousands of dollars on your book. And you've got to make them, again, believe that you're going to sell more than 5,000 copies of your book. or else they're, and let me say that most of the books that they publish don't sell 5,000 copies. Although my joke is my next book, I'm going to write it about sex, protecting the servers of sexy vampires or something like that, whatever the theme or the meme is that month. That's what I need to write about. But so it's a little bit about the hardest. So I say go download a book proposal from one of the major sites, read it. And I have people that they fill it out in like 10 minutes. No, it should take you like a week or a month to appropriately fill out a book proposal if you're hoping to get a book, because they want you to be thoughtful about how well your book is going to sell, what your organizational skills are like, what does your chapter list look like. You need to take that seriously, and most people don't take it seriously. They're submitting it with typos and stuff like that. You got a lot of typos on a resume or a book proposal, you're not going to get the job.
Yeah, that attention to detail has got to be important. I got a follow-up question on that one. Is there a certain, I guess, page count that makes a difference from a publishing standpoint, right? If I have a really good content, but it's only 100 pages versus 400 pages of just whatever, is there a key kind of how long does a book need to be considered?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd say a minimum of 200 to 250 pages. And then when they add the index in and what's called the front matter and all that other stuff, they're trying to get closer to 300. So 300 pages is kind of the magical sweet spot. At 200 pages, they may not do it. At 150 pages, they're not doing it. But so they want at least 200 pages, probably 250, plus the additional index and front matter they get in there. So you're really talking about a finished book that is probably closer to 250 to 300 pages. If you're delivering content that you write that's less than 200 pages, you might as well just write an ebook or a long, or some type of that. They're not going to publish it shorter than that, and except for in some very side cases. I think one of my books, Hacking the Hacker, may have been under 250 pages, but I have actually had my editors come back and say, "Hey, this is not long enough. You need to add." And I'm like, "It's so close. Can't you just make the index longer?"
That's when you start searching for adjectives, right? For all the different things and try to insert as much as you can. Maybe adjust the font size on the periods, that old trick, to make it
Yeah,
fill
yeah,
more
yeah.
space.
Yep, exactly.
So you talked a little bit about kind of like first steps, and I'm curious here because something that I think Jim and I have thought about in the past. What do we stay away from? What should we not be doing if we're looking to get into the writing game?
Yeah, certainly not something that's dead and tired to death. Not, again, the stories, oh, these great stories about fighting hackers, they're just not going to go anywhere. And some people get into topics that are so specific, like they're a master in some JavaScript protection thing, but it's not a book. So that I would say is careful. And you do need to, you've got to learn how to write. I've been writing for 20 years, over 1,100 magazine articles, but I was not a natural writer. And I really had to learn how to write a paragraph and an introductory sentence and a finishing and structure and that sort of stuff. But I do. The most common thing I get is somebody will tell me that they're going to write this great book that's about their great times, fighting against hackers, and I'm like, that book is just not going to sell to the publishers. And you can try to self-publish that book, but I'd say the average. That's maybe another thing. I've self-published one of my books. One of my 13 was self-published. I did well. I sold over 30,000 copies. I kind of knew what I was doing. I'd already written another 10 or 11 books. So I kind of knew what to do. On top of that, I got lucky. The average self-published book, and there's a lot of ways to do that these days, doesn't sell 50 copies. Like the average self-published copy person makes their family and friends buy the book, and then they sell maybe 10 more books. Like there is a rarity that a self-published book sells more than 100 copies, and there are people that sell 100,000 copies and a million copies. But it's like how many bands sitting out there in a bar get rich the next year? It's like one or two. Same thing with a self-published book. You're normally not going to get rich.
Hey Roger, I noticed that you mentioned that your first book was an O'Reilly book, and I've read a few of those myself. They always have an animal on the cover, so I had to go out on Google to figure out what animal was on your cover. Do you remember what it was?
It was a Trojan horse. It is a Trojan horse. Yep, I got a cover of it on my wall right here. It's a wooden Trojan horse. The book's called Malicious Mobile Code: Virus Protection for Windows. and it's very aged, right? It's like it was written in 1999, but it was a really good coverage of all the different types of malware that can infect a Windows system.
Yeah, very cool. I saw that. And, you actually just brought up another point there, right? So 1999, I guess there's a shelf life when you're reading technology books, right? There's some sweet spot that you have to reach that whatever goal of um, number of books to sell, 20,000, 30,000, because eventually that technology is going to be, quite frankly, dated.
Yeah, for sure. And you talk about even timing. A couple of my books were on operating systems like Windows Vista and things like that. You have to start writing those a year or two before before the product's actually released, because they want to release the book the day the software goes live. And the product's changing all the time, and there's nothing like you can't go on the internet and Bing or Google. How does this feature work? Right? You really have to beat it to death to find out how it works and what it does, because you're going to be part of the original source of it, and things change. And then, yeah, certainly like that Windows book sold forever. I even have one called Honeypots for Windows that I love, and that one sold for quite a while. About how to make honeypots, but yeah, they all become aged after a while. I try if you get most of your almost like I was going to say almost like people install software. 50% of the people that are going to install a patch install it in the first month. 50% that are going to install it in the first year. But there's always like 15 to 25% of people that never install the patch ever. Same thing kind of in books. Most of your people are going to buy your book, buy it in the first year, and then every year after that, it's even after the first couple of months, it dies down, and you get these checks. Yeah, I remember one time I went through a book editor. I can't. Maybe it was Honeypots for Windows, but I got a check for like $1.70 on one book. You get paid either monthly or yearly or quarterly or whatever you negotiate. But I got this check for like $1.70, and my book agent's like, "Oh, Roger, I'm sorry, we forgot to take our 20% out." And I was like, "You can keep the whole thing."
So, Roger, we found you through a presentation that you did called 10 Ways to Hack Multi-Factor Authentication. And I had to join the webinar just based on that title. I thought, really, 10 ways to hack multi-factor authentication? There were 10 ways and more. And so you wrote a book called Hacking Multi-Factor Authentication. My thought was just based on the title, that might lead some of us to believe that you don't like multi-factor authentication. Is that true?
Yeah, so I love multi-factor authentication. I think everybody should use it when they can to protect sensitive data. The whole reason I kind of wrote the book, and actually what it started out with is Kevin Mitnick, our chief hacking officer. He's this infamous hacker. He did this demo, MFA demo one day where he was hacking around LinkedIn or PayPal or something like that. And he did the video, and there was a tremendous, like, it created the biggest number of calls and emails into our company for any showing I think ever. And it was so overwhelming, Kevin couldn't get to them all. So the PR team at KnowBe4 said, "Hey, Roger, can you field some of these calls?" I'm like, "Yeah, I hack MFA all the time." And what I was shocked is that all the people are like, "Has Kevin reported this attack method? For this, the way that he hacked this MFA solution, it was doing a man-in-the-middle attack using Evil Jinx." I went, "No, it's not new. It's like it's the way that MFA has been hacked for like 20, 30 years. Evil Jinx has been around for 10 years." And I was like, "It's the opposite of new." And not only was it like reporters and newer people asking that question, it was my friends that have been doing computer security for 20 years. Like they were just shocked that I could send, or Kevin or whoever could send somebody a regular looking phishing email, and if you trick them into clicking on a malicious link and taking them to a rogue website, that you could bypass the MFA solution like it wasn't even there. And let me say that particular attack works against probably 85 to 95% of all MFA solutions. So I can send you an email, you click on it. If you don't realize that you've been sent to the wrong website, it's game over. And what Kevin was doing was a man in the middle attack where he was using Evil Jinx as the man in the middle proxy. So everything that the victim, quote unquote victim, did was sent to the real server, and everything the real server had, all the pictures and things like that, were sent back to the victim. And neither side knows that there's this man in the middle in between. But the victim would notice if they saw that the URL that they're connecting to is not the right URL. So it was amazing, and I remember thinking, I was like, I know how to hack MFA a bunch of different ways. So I wrote an article for InfoWorld magazine. I wrote for them for 15 years. I was a weekly security columnist. I called up the editor, said, hey, there's this hacking thing, and hacking MFA. I know 10 ways to do it. And by the time I got through writing the 10 ways articles, I knew 12 ways. So then I wrote 12 ways to hack MFA, did an ebook, and it ended up being my most popular webinar. Let me say, I've done hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of webinars. It's by far still the most popular webinar presentation I ever give. I gave it at RSA and Black Hat, both times to standing room only crowds of thousands of people and people out in the hallways and the overflow rooms and stuff like that. I was trying to talk my editor, Jim Minitel, to publishing a book on quantum cryptography and how quantum computers are going to break today's traditional encryption, which I wrote that book. But he's like, Roger, looking at these crowds, I think you should be writing a hacking MFA book. So I wrote that, Know How to Hack MFA over 50 different ways. And I tell people, I like MFA and everybody should use MFA. But the biggest problem is that most people, most sysadmins, most CISOs think that when they have deployed MFA, that they are significantly less likely to be hacked, and that is not true. I mean, as a matter of fact, I've been to some webinars just this week and last week, some cyber insurance webinars, where they're saying if you deploy MFA, it defeats 99% of ransomware or 99% of hackers. And it is not true.
I think that's one of the big takeaways. And again, it's not that you don't like MFA; it's that sometimes MFA is built like this wouldn't have happened if you used MFA, and that is simplifying it too much. I wanted to point back to that Evil Jinx man in the middle attack that you referenced because that's what really drew me in. I mean, it's just so when you kind of engineer it down to what's taking place, it's a framework that's available over the internet. It doesn't take a lot of technical know-how to pull it off. And I think that was one of the topics I really wanted to kind of discuss with you is, we talked about security researchers in our prep call for this podcast, right? And the idea that security researchers are out there, they're kind of the quote unquote white hats. They're the folks who are trying to discover exploits and they tell the company about the exploit before they make it public that they found this thing, right? And with the idea that the company can go ahead and build a patch and deploy it to their customers. Unfortunately, to the statistics that you talked about earlier, those patches don't roll out all the time. The reason I bring that up is that what happens with those discoveries is that they get turned into exploits. They turn into things like Evil Jinx, and then less sophisticated hackers take them and use the social engineering and phishing techniques to turn them into attacks on corporations or organizations so that they can ransomware them. So my feeling is kind of, and I want you to weigh in on this. And my feeling is that yeah, we're not going to get 99% of the hacks eliminated by using multi-factor authentication, at least using that term in general. But a lot of these hacks are we're looking the hackers are not extremely sophisticated. They're not security researchers. They're not coming up with the exploits themselves. They're downloading kits off of the internet and maybe doing some script customization, and they're looking for the easy targets and then they attack the easy targets. So layering MFA is going to thwart some percentage. Why? Because there's plenty of organizations out there that still don't have MFA. But if you're using a very basic form of MFA, if it's not biometrics, if it's not, kind of, a little bit more, then you're setting yourself up to have a false sense of security. I wonder what you think about that.
No, so exactly. And again, this has been taped a little bit in the past, but a big article this week is about a bunch of Coinbase users, people trading cryptocurrencies, being compromised in Coinbase, not getting their money back, right? Your cryptocurrency gets stolen. Well, a lot of those people were using MFA, right? And their problem is that they thought, oh, but they're like, everybody's like, use MFA. This is super high security. They don't tell you no MFA solution, or very few of them, and certainly not the people. They're like telling you, hey, this is high security. Use MFA, and this is high security. So they kind of relax. And let me say, I talk to people all the time that think that if they're using MFA, they can't be phished. I'm like, nope, I can phish you. I can send you an email and you click on the link and it's game over. They're shocked when they learn that. Now, with that said, like, I don't know what percentage of hacking will be fixed and remediated by MFA. Anybody taking that guess, good luck. But what I will say is, if you look at 100% of hacking, just my best guess, and I'm around MFA a lot, I've been doing it for decades. I bet that MFA prevents 30% of hacking. And that's no small amount. That's a third of all hacking, right? But MFA at its best only prevents authentication attacks. It doesn't prevent somebody from attacking unpatched software or eavesdropping or taking control of your, and you run, if you they trick you into running a Trojan on their desktop, it's game over, right? So MFA only works to prevent some types of authentication attacks. Now, with that said, it's a large percentage of authentication attacks. The primary thing that MFA stops is simple phishing, where someone's like, hey, give me your login name and password. And let me say, those are a large majority of phishing attacks. So using, you cannot give away your password if you don't know your password because you're using MFA. That is the sort of attack that MFA puts down. And again, it's probably 30%. But social engineering can get around that in a heartbeat. I mean, and not all of them, but most of them. And I can hack any MFA solution at least a couple of different ways. I can hack most of them 10 different ways. And it's just because, well, first of all, anything can be hacked. Anything can be hacked. And MFA is no different. So the reason I wrote the book, the reason I talk about it is I just want people to know there is this large contingent of people right now that think, oh, I'm using MFA, so I'm going to be so much more secure. Like all the cybersecurity, the cyber insurance industry has now decided that MFA is their litmus test. If you have MFA, you can get insurance. If you don't have MFA, you cannot get insurance. And they want you to do other things as well. But their primary thing is MFA. Again, I saw a slide from a major cyber insurance person 2 weeks ago that said MFA prevents 99% of ransomware attacks. And I'm just like, oh my God. I mean, can you imagine? And when I talk to an actuary, and I'm like, why are y'all saying this insaneness? Because it is not true. They're like, well, it prevents password attacks, and password attacks are the biggest thing, and blah blah blah. Password attacks are on the rise. I'm like, according to Acme, the 80% of all password guessing attacks are against APIs, application programming interfaces, and MFA doesn't work on those. So even if you're including password attacks, according to Acme, 80% of the 61 billion attacks that they detected in a year and a half were against APIs where MFA can't be used. So it's like oh, it's just, your idea of how many password attacks you're going to stop with MFA is a great idea, except for you don't really know the data that well. I'm a data-driven defense evangelist. I look into the data and I care about it. So I like to tell people use MFA where you can. Matter of fact, most of us are probably using 3 or 4 different types of MFA. We use an MFA for work. We have to use a different MFA if we're protecting our bank account, or our bank tells us what we have to use, and then you got a bank app for this thing, and then you're forced to use SMS MFA for a bunch of other things. You don't even have the choice. So most of us have multiple MFA solutions that we use in our lives, plus a bunch of different passwords. As a matter of fact, the big problem is the average person has 3 to 7 passwords that they share over 170 different websites. You're like, oh my God, that's terrible. They should not share those passwords. And you shouldn't. But good luck trying to use a single MFA solution that works across those 170 websites, because that's an even harder problem to solve.
So, Roger, just as a clarification, it was 12 ways to defeat multi factor authentication, and that Evil Jinx demo was part of that presentation. We'll have that in the show notes. I saw another YouTube where that Evil Jinx kit was modified to basically sit in front of Google Gmail, and they had some code in their page to help, detect and defeat kind of the headless browser, which, without getting into all the details, kind of the technology behind the scenes. Evil Jinx is, based on the Nginx reverse proxy technology, the Apache system. But obviously, really high tech companies like Google are putting features into their web page to try to defeat this. And in this demo, which I think was at Black Hat, they showed how even Google Gmail password with multi-factor could be stolen. So this is very real. This isn't just, yeah, dummy companies you can have this done to them. I mean, if you have enough know-how, even uh, probably the top one or two technology companies in the world and Google um, can face this kind of hacking exploit as well.
Yeah, and a lot of times I really base it upon type of MFA, right? You have all different types of MFA, biometrics, you have hardware tokens, phone as a token, software tokens. There's all these different types of MFA. And just being a type of MFA makes you susceptible to particular types of attacks that are many times difficult to prevent, like biometrics. If someone steals your fingerprints, like I was involved in a 2015, my fingerprints were part of this attack by Chinese APT against the U.S. government, and they stole 5.6 million people's fingerprints, all 10 of them. They got my fingerprints, 5.6 million people, other people. My wife's fingerprints were in there, and she'd worked as a teenager in a shipyard, like 30 years ago. I'm sorry, honey, I meant 10 years ago, and she had her fingerprints stolen. Well, once your fingerprints are stolen, unless you do some type of Al Capone surgery or something like that, what are you going to do? If your fingerprint is your authenticator, how can any system that's asking for your fingerprint alone, a lot of the fingerprint systems are one factor, not multi factor, how can it really know it's you if your fingerprint's been stolen? Because your biometrics, they're really not secrets, right? Anybody can go behind you, pick up a soda can that you threw away, or a candy wrapper, and then all of a sudden they've got your fingerprints. And if there's some remote system that asks for your fingerprint, they can now start duplicating that fingerprint and using it. And you always have the biometric vendors going, there's no way they'll be able to fake our fingerprints or our retina scan or our facial scan. And the next day, there's like some 18-year-old in YouTube showing how he faked the facial scan, for like $1.80 of materials. Like it's just a joke. I'm like, it's 30 years of biometric vendors telling me, oh, we figured out how to stop people from faking it, and 30 years of them absolutely failing, by some kid the next day. But they all have their, like all, hardware tokens and smart cards and time-based one-time passwords versus event-based one-time password tokens. Once you tell me the type of MFA that you have, as soon as you tell me what it is, there's at least 5 to 10 hacks that apply to your solution just because what it is. And it isn't a bug. It's not like they're going to go out and patch something. Like the time-based one-time password ones have a seed database, and if someone compromises the seed database, they can create a duplicate instance of your like your Google Authenticator or something. It's not a bug that they're going to fix, although they could, but it's literally something that's an inherent weakness in the type of MFA that it is, and they all have their strengths and weaknesses.
I've heard a lot of discussion around different types of MFA, and one that's come up as we've talked with vendors in the past is this idea of phishable versus non-phishable MFA. And I think of your fingerprint story, and I wonder, is there really a difference between phishable and non-phishable MFA, or is that just marketing speak?
Well, so there are certainly some that are more resilient against common types of phishing, like FIDO2 tokens, FIDO, that's an alliance, it's a standard, an open standard. They are resilient against the man in the middle attack, like I just described with Evil Jinx, like Jim and I were talking about, because they require device registration to the actual website and vice versa. So that if you were a man in the middle attack, your token is actually not going to activate because it is not registered for the man in the middle site website that you're at. And so that makes it not phishable in that way. But there are other types of phishing attacks that I guess the vendor's not considering. And let me say, I get that a lot. I get a lot of people, oh, you can't hack it this way. You can't. Yeah, I can hack it. Like, can I phish every single MFA token type that is out there? There is no doubt in my mind. that I can send a phishing attack. And that's the thing. Once, MFA protects you against about 30% of attacks. But once I know that you're using a particular type of token, it actually probably makes you more likely to fall because the average person thinks MFA makes them unhackable, and then they get hacked. And let me say, very very common. Ask all those 1,000 Coinbase users using MFA that have lost tens of millions of dollars. They were told, if I'm using MFA, I'm so much, I'm using high security, so much likely not to be hacked. And then they're like, but I got hacked because somebody sent me a phishing email. Like they're always, it's like this rut-row moment. And they're like, oh, no one told me that I could just be sent a phishing email. So, is there an unphishable MFA? Not that I know of, but it depends on how you define phishing. It depends upon because like one of the most common ones that's the hardest to prevent from phishing is me sending you to a fake website. So it looks so you click on a link that goes to the wrong place, and then I completely fake your experience. A lot of the best resilient MFA tokens won't even activate if you go to the wrong website. But all I have to do as the attacker is fake like it worked and then go, hey, we're having an error with your token. We're going to have tech support call you to talk about replacing your token. And then you start asking a bunch of personal questions. What's your login ID? Blah, 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 blah. And you can start phishing them. Or you think you're logging into a bank. They're like, oh, we need to confirm your credit card. We're having a problem with your token. We need to confirm your credit card your debit card information at the bank. It is almost impossible for an MFA vendor to prevent a completely fake website from just faking the experience. And that's why it's tough to prevent phishing. They're thinking about phishing as, hey, stealing a password or this or that. But to prevent all phishing, I don't know the solution.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes back to the quality of the attempt, right? And I think we're all familiar with the terrible IRS calls that we get, right? We're going to be thrown in jail, right? If we don't, answer the call right there that second and talk to somebody. But I think it's just a matter of time where one for one replica of a site makes it extremely convincing for people. And we're talking about you don't need, this is a numbers game, right? They're trying to get anything and everything. They only have to succeed once to be successful. Whereas if you're on the other side and trying to do defense against this, you have to be right every single time. And I think it's a very difficult challenge for a lot of folks that are out there.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And let me say, so I said I installed a lot of MFA solutions in my career. Almost everybody that ever hired me to put in MFA had been compromised one or more times, badly compromised. Like no one proactively, prior to this year, no one proactively called and said, hey, I want to get MFA. It's always because they've been compromised. So like, hey, I need to get MFA. I would go in and spend, and it would be these $1 million projects and multiple months of time, and I would get accolades. Oh, it was on time, on budget, which that and it in the computer world is just insane, right? On time and on budget. But every single one of those customers eventually got hacked again, and not through the MFA solution, but through unpatched software or social engineering in most cases, or it could be a misconfiguration, overly permissive permissions on an AWS storage bucket or something. It's and let me say that the CISOs are shocked. They're like, wait a minute, I just spent $1 million and I put in MFA and I got hacked again because someone didn't patch the VPN software. That's another thing. Like these days of COVID, yeah, everyone's got VPNs. VPNs will save you. Get on a VPN. You've got to have a VPN. You've got to have an MFA protected VPN. But then you have a large contingent of people that aren't patching the VPN solution on the server side or the client side. And that's how the ransomware guys are getting in. They're literally getting in on the solution that all these people were told that would protect them because they then stopped doing the basics.
So, what are some common misconceptions then around MFA? Because I feel like we've talked an awful lot about, what they're good at. We've talked about that in previous episodes, but also, having this conversation, maybe opening up, people's eyes that it's not the end all be all. What are some of the common misconceptions that you see being put out there into the field or the industry or just conversation that people need to be aware of?
Well, let me start with this one because I think 99% of computer security experts don't understand this. And you probably do. You two probably do. But so many people don't. And this is a technology thing. But if I've lost you and you're falling asleep, pay attention here because I'm going to teach you something about authentication that most people don't know. which is no matter how you authenticate, so whether it's login name and password, whether it's MFA, fingerprint, biometrics, smell, whatever it is, 10-factor authentication. No matter how you authenticate, after you successfully authenticate, your authentication is tracked using a token or a cookie. If it's on a website, it's going to be this text-based cookie. It's this text-based cookie that's downloaded to your browser or in Windows. Every time, no matter how you log in Windows, with login name and password or fingerprint or facial scan, Windows Hello. After you authenticate in Windows, you're going to get either a Kerberos ticket or an NTLM token. And on a website, it's going to be a cookie. And it's kind of like the driver's license to go, yep, this is me. I've been identified and this is who I am. And now you go through this authorization process. Am I allowed to access this file, this folder, this service? But no matter how you authenticate, once you've successfully authenticated, behind the scenes, it's all treated the same. And I think like early on when I didn't really understand identity and authentication well enough, I thought like if I did a fingerprint scan in my head, I thought the fingerprint was being sent to the database I was trying to log into, and the database was like, "Yep, that's Roger Grimes' fingerprint. He's allowed to access this database." But I didn't know it was just a Kerberos token or ticket or whatever in the background or a cookie, and it was the same regardless of how I logged in. And that token can be captured by attackers and man-in-the-middle attack and evil jinx. And if they get a hold of that token, and it was funny back in the day when I started to realize this is when they were using a hacking tool on Firefox browser called Firesheep. But it would just capture your token, and once it has your token, that's your identity, that's your driver's license. That person that captures your token can become you, and that was a big misunderstanding. So people, well, I'm protected. You are, with MFA, protected against an authentication attack, but you're not protected against anything after you authenticate. So if you've got unpatched software, if you got somebody that's in on your computer or another computer and they get that session cookie or token, it's game over, no matter how you logged in.
Yeah, you're basically talking about a fake ID, right? You got into the bar with somebody who, obviously it's a higher quality fake ID because it's a one for one replica of it, but that's the same kind of concept. And I hear and I see a lot of different things now in the space around continuous authentication and not just authenticating, once to get into a resource, but using signals and other parts of data to try and have a more continuous authentication model in place. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
I think it's a great idea. This whole idea that we authenticate once at the beginning and it's binary and then we're in is kind of silly. So I like this. Sometimes it's called zero trust or something, but this idea that we're being authenticated based upon not only our successful authentication, but what we're doing, how we're doing it, even maybe like keystroke dynamics, how fast you typed in your password, not just your password, but how fast you typed in your password, what letters you hit, how fast apart and what kind of, ratio, but even like where you're from, like a lot of I love Google and Microsoft and others that go, hey, you just logged in from China 2 hours ago and now you're logging in from Texas. Is this you? Like, is this like, do you accept that this is something normal? So they're looking that a lot of people don't know that Microsoft and Google look at hundreds of factors already and have, let me say, for half a decade to look to see, are you who you say you are? And I absolutely think the future of authentication is, less bothering you, more looking at what you do. Your device is going to be a big part of, your authentication. If you're coming from the same laptop or pad device or cell phone, that's going to be a big part of your identity. Is that's the same device that Roger used before. And then they're going to look at location and they're going to look at actions and they're going to look at the browser and other things that are involved there and go, okay, I'm going to make a risk score. And when Roger is just checking his bank balance, this type of risk score means we don't have to ask for more authentication. But if he's going to go transfer $10,000, we're going to check and make sure his risk score is a lot lower or higher, or however it's going to be. Yeah, that's a big part of the future of authentication. The idea that we authenticate once, and then boom, anything can happen. Well, that's really kind of crazy.
I'm going to make the profound statement that passwords suck. I think we all knew that, right? And that's why MFA has been such an improvement. But MFA is usually password plus something else. So you still have the sucky part. So why not just go passwordless? Is that better than MFA?
Well, yeah, I think so. It depends. First of all, the first time I read an article saying passwords are going away was 30 years ago, and we all now have more passwords than we ever. And that's because passwords kind of work for low security scenarios. They're easy to change if you need to update them. Blah 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 blah. Like a 2-year-old types in a password, no problem, you know. But an adult has a hard time using MFA solutions sometimes. But I think the future of authentication is that there is less what's called user friction. Like when you use your credit card, they don't know who you are and if that's you when you use your credit card. But then if you're buying, like my wife and I, when we moved to our new house recently, we were buying two large TVs in Walmart or somewhere at the same time, and they let my transaction go through and then denied hers. And like 2 minutes later, I saw there was a little SMS message going, "Is this really you trying to buy the second TV?" Well, that's kind of probably I think the ultimate future of authentication. If they see you coming from your same device and location, that you're going to kind of be allowed to do what you do. They'll watch your actions, see what you do, see if it seems like normal. There will be this constant monitoring of what you do, and as long as you're doing, what you normally do, and it's not something high risk, you're probably not going to be bothered. But if you go to transfer $10,000, then maybe you have to provide an MFA token or provide the last four digits of your credit card or something like that. So I do think the future is not only passwordless, but I think tokenless. I think for the most part, 20 years from now, our grandkids are going to laugh about the archaic, methods that we used, like to do authentication, because it's just going to be a fabric of what they do, and for the most part, they're not going to be bothered until it becomes like a high risk event.
It'll be like, when people hear like a modem send now, and there's like these flashbacks that go back to hearing modem signals and people staying off the phone. It'll be the same type of concept where you used to do what to log into things? Like you had to log into things.
Yeah, you kids don't know how hard it was when I had to remember 20 different passwords. I had to create different passwords with different patterns for different sites, and yeah, I think they're gonna go, what? They're not gonna be able to comprehend. I think you're right.
You're going to be old when someone says, "What's a password?"
Yeah. I remember my daughter. God bless one of my. I've got three daughters and a son, but one of my youngest daughter was telling her friends, "My dad remembers what it was like when DVDs were used." And I'm like, "Indeed, I do." Should I
Uh-huh.
mention VHS tapes to her?
Right, the whole VHS beta battle. All right, now we're starting to age ourselves. I'm getting a little bit off
Or
topic, but
I love the YouTube videos, like when they give young kids and they tell them to dial a regular phone. Have you seen those things?
oh yeah, they
Oh
can't
my
figure it out.
God, I laugh hysterically. They don't know how to dial a phone.
Yeah, the rotary one was my favorite.
Somebody sees a floppy disk and they think it was created on a 3D printer of the save symbol.
Oh yeah, people don't know what the save signal looks like, right? They see it in their app, but how many people, you're right, still remember the 3.5 inch or the 5 1/4 or even tape drive? Roger, you've been really generous with your time, and we want to start to wrap things up. But I am curious around something non-identity, because we were talking, before we hit the old record button here, about some of our old restaurant and food service days, and we share a little bit of a background there. And I'm hoping that you will give us your best or worst story from when you worked in the food service industry.
Sure. And by the way, I think everybody should spend some time in the food service industry. It teaches you how to service and multitask and take bad customers and good customers and add and subtract and stuff like that. I think everybody should do it. I work. One of my first major waiter jobs was working for Chi-Chi's. It was kind of like Mexican food and stuff. But my first day, I'd never waited tables before. It's my first day. I've had the training and blah blah blah. And I don't know why they did this, but they gave me like a table of 20. Like I just to this day don't know why they did that to a brand new green person. But I had like 8 drinks on a round tray going to that table. And I know, I'm sure you can imagine what happened, but somebody pulled a drink off of one side of that tray, and the rest of the drinks went into this lady's fancy purse, went all over her fur and fancy purse, and I cost Chi-Chi's like $2,000 my first table. And I felt guilty for years, but now I'm thinking, my God, they gave me like, it was either 16 or 20 people as my first table. That's bad management.
That's a terrible start. I mean, really? I mean, come on. That's, there's got to be a better way to approach that. I mean, you're telling that story, and as soon as I heard you say someone took a drink off, I was like, there goes the balance. I'm like, I know what's happening next. I know what's coming.
And that's my joke, right? When someone's waiting and coming to a table with a bunch of people, I'm like, hey, do you want me to pull this glass off? And every waiter and waitress like, no, because they've been there. They know,
Right.
they know that jerk.
Yeah, stay away. Don't touch me. Let me think. My restaurant story is, so I actually worked in restaurants for a long time, like over a decade, I think, from busboy to management to bartending. I did it
Way
kind
to
of
go.
all. And this was when I worked for Chili's, which shout out to my Chili's crew who's out there, because I know there are actually some people who might actually be listening to this, even though they're not really in the identity space. But shout out to them. Um, my story is, this probably doesn't going to paint me in a good light, but I always thought it was interesting. So it was a lunch shift, and the Chili's that I worked at was a test store. So what that meant was we would get test menu items before the rest of the chain would, to gather customer feedback and see if it makes sense, and if people liked it, and if it did, then it would go out to the a broader audience. And we were testing this brand new thing called a chicken ranch sandwich. It was basically, buffalo chicken ranch sandwich. It was a fried chicken breast with buffalo sauce and ranch dressing. Relatively simple. But what you see on the box is what it is. And the lady had ordered it, and I put the order in, and she was my only table, and that was pretty much it. Food comes out, and she takes a bite of it, and I go and say, how things going, and what do you think? And she's like, oh, it's great, but I don't really I don't really taste the ranch in this. And I look at the sandwich, and sure enough, the cooks had left the ranch dressing off of the you know buffalo chicken ranch sandwich. So rather than me, and this will tell you a little bit about my youth, and I promise you I have changed. What I rather than fixing the issue, I immediately on the spot just said, oh, the ranch, it's battered right in with the chicken. Why don't you take a few more bites, and let me know, and we can get you some more ranch. So I come back after a couple bites, and sure enough, oh, it was the best. I could totally taste the ranch. Definitely made a lot of sense. There
Sounds
was
like
no
social
ranch on that
engineering.
sandwich. Yep, total social engineering. There was no ranch on that sandwich whatsoever.
She tasted
But
it.
and I'll tell you, I had no excuse. It was just I was lazy and dumb and young and didn't really care about it. And for some reason, that's just the way I chose to work that out. And I apologize to Chili's management, who probably isn't listening, but the statute of limitations is over, so I feel comfortable telling that story. Jim, what about yourself? Any good food service industry stories?
I've got a little one, yeah. So, I never really worked in the food service industry. I'm 46 years old. I'll admit that. And I had an opportunity to go to the Sturgis motorcycle rally this year and work as a bar back. And it basically got me there for free, got me in for free, and on top of it, I made money. And I thought, wow, this is an easy, cheap way to go to the motorcycle rally that I've wanted to, that's been on my bucket list. I never worked so hard, Jeff. I never worked so hard. 5 days, my body was giving me fits. Um, I made it through the week with a new appreciation for people who do that job. And all I can say is tip your bartenders. They deserve it because they work their butts off.
Yeah, that's a great story. Two things. Whenever I see somebody that's a server, has been a server, if you've been a bar back, Jeff, I heard you say that you were a busser and that sort of
Yep.
stuff. Always go. You usually know the term Hobart. Hobart is like that industrial thing that cleans a whole bunch of dishes and glasses and silverware all at once. You put everything in a big tray, green tray, and you throw it in the Hobart and you close the lid and it steam cleans it with hot water. And the other one is I if I see any waiter or waitress struggling, like they're just getting behind, they go, I can see you're in the weeds. And they immediately know that I worked in the food service industry, and that I too have been there, and it's never a good place to be.
The weeds is a rough spot to be. I think, yeah, and I totally agree with you, Roger. I think everybody should have to do some sort of food service role at some point, and learn that your ranch dressing isn't the most important thing in the world sometimes.
Yeah,
uh,
forget the 2 years of mandatory military training. That's what I used to think that everybody needed. It's 2 years at least of food service.
oh yeah, absolutely, and yeah, I think the Hobart's a good thing. The weeds, you can start to speak the lingo. 86, right? You're out of
That's right.
something. I
That's
think
right.
once you are in the business, it's difficult to go to a restaurant again and not understand how it works. Right? You're no longer kind of a passenger. You are on the inside, and you start to spot things. Right? Is okay. That's how many table section that person has.
What's that great movie with Ryan Reynolds that covers that
Waiting.
industry? Waiting. Terrific movie. Cannot believe it did. I cannot believe it didn't win an Oscar.
It's fantastic. I mean, this is now we're really getting into the niche, but if you are all interested in the food service industry and like comedy, and I still think it's one of the closest representations of what it's actually like to work in a restaurant, go check out the movie Waiting with Ryan Reynolds, Justin Long, Anna
Justin Long,
Faris.
Anna Faris, like all kinds of famous. That comedian guy was in it. Like that started a lot of careers.
Yeah, it was some little indie flick, I think within the last 20 years or so. I'm not sure when it came out, but it was immediately a cult classic, I think, for people who were in the restaurant biz.
Yeah, Jim, I love how did you describe it? You remember how you described that movie? Office space for the food service industry.
Oh, that's right. Yep.
Yeah. Well, I think that's you know, go out, check it out. It came out in 2005. I just looked it up, so we can feel old together. But movie's called Waiting. Definitely a recommendation to check out. Um, I think we'll go ahead and leave it for this week. But before we do, I want to give Roger and the team here also to a chance to kind of any final thoughts around our conversation today around multi-factor authentication. Roger, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Jim.
I just my reason for living is to help security defenders really focus on what's the top ways that you're attacked, which is usually social engineering, unpatched software, sometimes password guessing type stuff, and realize that that is 90% of the battle, and all these other things are just really distractions from what the primary things are. And one day, social engineering and unpatched software and passwords will not be the top three reasons why you're successfully attacked. Just figure out what the top things are and focus on those things till they're no longer the top things. That is the secret to being a better computer security defender.
Right on. How about Jim, yourself?
I think it's pretty similar to what Roger just said, which is look, the show that we put on today about hacking MFA isn't meant to discourage you from implementing MFA, right? The idea as a information security professional is um, continue to advance the ball forward, continue to strengthen the defenses, but let's not stick our head in the sands and think that, oh, if I implement an MFA, I'm bulletproof, right? The idea is continue to do the research, continue to educate ourselves, and try to stay one step ahead of the adversary. MFA definitely puts you one step ahead of if you didn't have MFA at a very minimum. Next level is passwordless. Next level is stronger MFA. Because one of my big takeaways from Roger's book is that there he had 12 ways to hack MFA. Some of those were kind of the scarier ones. Some of them were a little more obscure. So I think if you can thwart some of them and maybe not all of them, you're still better than you were. I always just kind of believed in the saying of don't let perfection be the enemy of better. We've got to get better.
You got it right. Everybody should use MFA. Everybody.
I feel like it's okay to get smarter, and this is just a way to get smarter, right? Um, all right, I think that's a good spot. We'll leave it. We're going to have a whole bunch of links in the show notes this week. We'll have a link to Roger on LinkedIn. We'll have a link to the nuclear ransomware webinar that he'll be giving on September 1st, the 12 ways to defeat multi-factor authentication webinar, a bunch of his books. Definitely go check them out. The one we talked about today mostly was around hacking multi-factor authentication, but several, I would say, Roger, right, to choose from from an identity and security perspective for people to check out.
Yep.
And with that, we're going to go ahead and call it for this week. Thank you all for listening. Roger, thank you so much for joining us. Jim, thank you as always. And we'll talk with everyone in the next one.
Thanks, Jeff, Jim, and everyone. Thanks for showing up. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.